You're listening to The Audit, presented by IT Audit Labs. I'm your co-host and producer, Joshua Schmidt. You're joined by Eric Brown and Nick Mellum, as usual, from IT Audit Labs. And today, our guest is Adam Russell from Schellman. He's a Minnesota native, and we brought him on the show today to talk about SOC assessments, and we'll see where the conversation goes. Thanks for joining us, Adam. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. I'm actually not a Minnesota native, though.
You're not. You live in Minnesota currently, though, yeah?
I do live in Minnesota, yes. But I'm actually originally from New York State. Grew up south of Rochester, New York, so a similar name to a city here. But and then I spent 10 years in Colorado before I moved to Minnesota in 2022.
So, Adam, what's your background at Schellman? You work at Schellman here in Minnesota. Can you tell us a bit about your background, how you got to where you're at in your career at this point?
Yeah, my title at Schellman is technical lead. It's kind of a unique title. They've recently developed kind of a dual pathway opportunity for individuals that aren't interested in people management. In the traditional CPA or just kind of consulting firm, there's generally kind of this linear pathway where you start as an associate or analyst. It kind of depends on the organization. You then move up to senior manager all the way up to either partner or principal, depending on the specific titles. Ultimately, I'm still an individual contributor, but I've been with Schellman about over 2.5 years at this point, but have been in the audit space in some form for a little over 7 years.
Well, Adam, we wanted to get into SOC assessments today. That's kind of your passion, and doing a pre-production. It seemed like you had a kind of a fire to educate people, probably your clients, and probably even beyond. I'd love to hear, what you think about SOC assessments in general, but also why they're so important for organizations to consider as a part of their security makeup.
Yeah. So SOC is great. I'm obviously not going to say anything other than that because I do SOC audits, but it truly is a great assessment framework. I just think there's a lot of misconceptions and misunderstandings about it, which is kind of interesting to me because they've actually been around for a long time. SOC audits, as we know them today, they're really kind of came about 15 years ago, about this point. 2010 is when they turned into what they were. But there's a history going back even to the early 90s. There was an old auditing standard called SAS 70, which was essentially the framework that SOC as we know it today was built off of. So it's been around for close to 30 years, or actually more than 30 years at this point. I think because it's not as prescriptive of a framework as something like ISO 27001, people just don't necessarily always understand it. And also, I think with the just huge growth we've seen in the startup space around SaaS applications, especially over the last 10 years, there's just been a lot of organizations that all of a sudden knew they needed to get this thing called SOC, but it was especially a bunch of startup people. They didn't really understand what it is, but they just had, their customers kept bringing it up about whether or not they had a SOC audit. And so it's just kind of one of those things that is very important and has a lot of impact on the industry. But like a lot of things, it's actually quite complex because it isn't always clear as to how you're actually going to accomplish your goals with it. So ultimately, a SOC audit is intended to validate the security program that's in place at an organization. There's basically 5 different principles and criteria that can apply to a SOC audit. Security is the only one that's required, but there's 4 others that you basically can scope in depending on the needs of the organization. And they're processing integrity, confidentiality, privacy, and I'm forgetting availability, are the total 5 that you could have in there. So that's also the misconception I think that comes in is like people think that it's a security assessment, which it is, but then they'll also be hearing about this applies to a privacy program as well. And so I think sometimes people just get confused or wrapped up in some of the nuance.
So Adam, wouldn't you say that just a high level kind of layman's way of describing it is it's a way for an organization to have attestation of their controls?
Yes, that's exactly what it is. And so when you really boil it down to that simple terminology, it can make sense. But even I have discussions with people that they don't even necessarily what does attestation mean? That some of these words for people that aren't in this industry, especially, like I said, going up especially to startups, really, you'll have a bunch of people that are in sales, but they keep hearing this term, and so they know they need to get this thing. And so then they hear these words like attestation or certification or whatever it is, and they get confused as to what it all means.
Adam, we have to use it's in the manual. We have to use those because then we can charge more for the services, right? We got to use big words.
That is, yes, big words always makes it better.
The other day, and this doesn't happen very often, But I was actually struck dumb by something that I had heard in an account we were working with. They were bringing on a new vendor, that multi-million-dollar software as a service that was going to be involved in their PCI environment. And when I asked them, I said, well, do you have a SOC 2 that we can take a look at? No, we don't provide those, but if you want us to do one, then we can do it, but you have to pay for it. And they actually phrased it in a way that they started out, I thought it was on a game show, where they're like, well, do you know how much a SOC 2 costs? And I was like, okay, this is going in a different direction. And then they launched into how they don't do them, but if a customer wanted them, then the customer would pay for it. So I had never heard that before. And I must have had a look on my face like Steve Harvey in Family Feud. Have you run into something like that before, Adam? Have you heard of that?
We have, actually. We've had a couple of clients that have come to us, and it's really, they're doing it because they have one specific strategic account that's requiring it. I will say I don't exactly know what the true payment terms ended up being in that specific scenario. But yeah, that's actually not the first time that I've heard it. Remaining compliant with any sort of framework, whether it be information security, healthcare, whatever it might be, it takes a lot of work. And that's why organizations struggle with them, I think, is because they don't necessarily always give them the resources that they really need in order to support these programs. But they are very important. And so there's this constant struggle between, compliance versus reality, which is compliance is always trying to catch up with whatever the threat landscape is. And you have a lot of organizations that are kind of filtering in and out, and they aren't necessarily they don't want to put the resources in there to kind of get what they need to. But at the end of the day, a lot of times they usually can't secure this key account if they don't have these things in place. So it's kind of like, what's driving the cart, really?
With a SOC, an organization can have their own security controls, and some of them may not adhere to a framework, but you're essentially just going in and testing their controls to see if they're adhering to them. Have you run across anything where you're like, oh, that's interesting? Or on the other side, have you been surprised with something that was really cool?
Oh, yeah. No, tons of times. I think a lot of times people think that the size of the organization can sometimes make it more secure or better than smaller organizations. And I've seen some really robust, really great information security programs at very small organizations. And conversely, I've seen some huge organizations that frankly don't have a very robust or effective information security program. So I think that's sometimes a misconception, is especially with larger entities, because they've got so many things going on. Again, depending on the resource, and then like a small organization, they might only need to support one or two different frameworks. Whereas Nick, you had mentioned earlier, PCI, HIPAA, SOC 2, ISO 27001, NIST. There's all these different frameworks out there. And sometimes they think that, oh, well, we're good in one, so we're good in all. And that doesn't apply. So the nice thing about SOC, as I had mentioned earlier, is it is a little bit more flexible as to how you can actually arrive at something. But yeah, a lot of times people try and put things in there that doesn't necessarily make sense. I mentioned the 5 different criteria you could have in there. And sometimes organizations will try and kind of, I don't want to say double dip, but they'll want to bring in certain controls or things to make them look better, but they don't necessarily apply to the criteria they're in.
Mm-hmm.
I think, I was working with an organization, and I do often, and one of the roles is, vetting or vendors that are coming in to the organization. And a lot of times the people that I work with in this group, they see SOC 2 and they automatically think, oh, we can just like bypass all of our controls because they are SOC 2. Right. So we should be good to go. And we always echo back to them. We still need to do our process, have them fill out these questionnaires so we can better understand what their controls are. Just because we always want to make sure everybody knows, because they have met SOC 2 at one point, right? They're continuing up with it. We need to make sure we continue to vet them. But what I'm saying here also branches into a question, Adam, is, does SOC 2 to you mean something different if it's like a financial organization versus maybe a Fortune 500 IT company? Or, is there different meanings to how SOC might go to those organizations?
Yeah, I think really the nice part with those different criteria is they can apply really nicely depending on the type of organization that you're dealing with. So for example, as I mentioned earlier, security is required for all of it. If you want to get a SOC 2 report or a SOC 2 audit, you have to have security in scope. But we'll have a lot of organizations like, for example, healthcare. In that case, that's where, confidentiality and privacy is going to be a lot higher scrutiny and, consideration that they may want to consider in scope. Whereas like a financial institution, yeah, of course, those are still going to be relevant, but maybe something like the processing integrity criteria is going to be more applicable because especially like a payroll processor is probably the easiest one to use as an example. If they're processing payroll, you want to make sure that all of the inputs match what the outputs are, particularly in that case. You could make that argument for any sort of data processing, but there are certain industries where certain things are just higher risk than others. And so, yeah, that's kind of, again, the nice thing is it is so flexible. You can apply it in a lot of different ways, but that also comes with its own challenges because that's the thing. People get confused about how this can actually apply to their organization.
So, Adam, a couple of questions for you. I've just been thinking as you've been talking through these of some applications. So let's say you're on the consulting side and you're going in to help an organization and the organization's going to onboard, say, a new SaaS solution, for example, and the company says, well, we don't have a current SOC 2, but we do have an ISO 27001. Where would you see that a 27001 would be an okay substitution for a SOC 2?
So I don't want to say they're comparable, but they serve different purposes, but ultimately they're both information security frameworks and assessments. We have a lot of clients that will either do one or the other or both. And I've seen in tons of vendor questionnaires, particularly when we're analyzing this particular part of an organization, where they'll say like on their security questionnaire, they'll kind of give an either or. They'll say like, do you have a SOC 2 or an ISO 27001? But there are validity to both of them. To be clear, I work with our ISO team, but it's not something I'm an expert in, so I wouldn't want to speak to like why it's better or not. But they kind of serve different purposes. And again, this goes back to ISO is a lot more prescriptive. It has its listing of controls that an organization has to comply with the exception, of course, they can scope certain ones out if it just doesn't actually apply to them for any number of reasons. But it's just a lot more strict in the way that you actually have to get to your end point. Whereas with SOC, you have a lot more flexibility in the way you can actually get to that. But they both have their pros and cons. One's not necessarily better than the other. They just kind of serve different purposes. And some organizations, they're really dead set on one or the other. I've also seen that where they're like, we only accept an ISO certification or we only accept SOC. And I've had that conversation with them to try and understand like what's the reasoning. And some of it is because they've been burned by something in the past where they're like, oh, we got this really terrible SOC report that really didn't make sense, or it was for an application that we thought it applied to and it didn't even apply to it. So that's kind of where you need to make sure that you're having those relevant conversations with people, making sure that they are understanding what they are getting from the third party that they're getting this from, whether it be a SOC report or an ISO cert.
And where would you see that it would be okay to just get the summary of the SOC report instead of actually seeing the SOC 2, where a company might say, well, we're not comfortable giving you this because it does have some of the things that might be more sensitive to our organization, but here's the SOC 3.
I personally have not run into this very often. I do know that some organizations, they do hold their SOC 2 report pretty close to the chest, which I think is kind of interesting because it isn't intended to be just fully publicly available. You mentioned SOC 3, and that's the entire intent of a SOC 3 is it is supposed to be publicly facing. It basically strips out a lot of the more just we'll call it sensitive information, a lot of the detail behind it. But usually if someone's really being hesitant to share their SOC 2, it would kind of make me wonder what's in it a little bit more. Is there a bunch of testing exceptions? Or is there something in there that maybe they're not necessarily happy with how something went, or maybe they just know that there's a particular area that their customers keep asking about and they just either haven't built out that part of the program, or like I said, there was some sort of testing exception that I don't want to say they're trying to hide, but potentially they're trying to hide. So like I said, I haven't run into this super frequently, but if someone was being super hesitant, especially during either some sort of reassessment where they've previously provided it to you, or you're trying to establish a new relationship with some new SaaS provider and they're just being really cagey about it, that would give me a little bit of pause, and I would want to understand kind of why. And it could be for any number of reasons. Like I said, they could either be proud of it. It could be that they're not done with it yet. That could also be something where they're kind of just trying to hold up the process because they don't have one yet and they're still going through their assessment, or they did get one and it didn't go super well. And so they're now like, well, great, I have this, but basically it doesn't give me a lot of creed or cadence because it doesn't have a lot of good information in it. It's because there was a testing exceptions or it was a full-on qualified report where there was enough issues where we actually had to qualify the opinion, whatever it might be.
I'm curious to know if Eric has any tricks on getting organizations prepared for an audit or a SOC assessment. I know, Eric, you work with a lot of different types of folks. I'd love to hear what's in your bag of tricks and how you kind of take an overview of an organization so they're prepared for something like this.
I think one of the first things that we want to understand is what business are they in, what sort of data they have that they need to protect, and then what have they done in the past, and who is the audience of this? Is there some sort of regulatory work that they're doing? Do they have customers that are asking for something? And then as you get more granular, well, what controls do they already have in place? What's their information security policies? What do those look like? What sort of standards do they have? So all of that will inform how much work actually has to be done before you could even assess the organization, either using a framework that has criteria around what you're going to assess, or going back to the attestation piece, if they have those controls in place or if they need to write those controls so that you know what it is you're going to measure.
It sounds like communicating is a huge part of your job and just educating, which we've already established. Have you seen any kind of innovative ways other than just talking over a Zoom meeting or sitting down for a cup of coffee at a conference table? Have you gotten any kind of creative input on, maybe coming up with videos or any other way to educate internally?
Yeah, I mean, there's tons of different ways. So Schellman actually does a really good job of promoting a lot of external facing learning content. We have a whole learning center where people create content around all sorts of things, SOC obviously being one of the big ones, but we have a whole ISO team, we have PCI. They put out a lot of content out there kind of explaining some of the nuances of that. So I kind of echo a lot of things that Eric said. One of the best things you can do as an organization who's considering going down the SOC path is really getting a good understanding of what it is. And I think this is where people then, I alluded to this earlier, they just do a quick Google of it, and they sometimes get these organizations that will literally promote and say, like, we can get you SOC ready in 2 weeks.
Eric's smiling.
They don't, there's a lot of issues with that. And it's exactly that. There's, for those that are not familiar, there's two different types of, well, there's multiple different types of SOC reports, but there's two different types of assessments you can go through. There's a type 1 assessment and a type 2 assessment. A type 1 is just testing the design of controls, which is essentially just saying, like, okay, you've provided some control language. When an independent auditor comes in, we essentially just look to say, like, okay, you've said you have this in place, and we'll look and say, like, yes, that is true, whatever that might be, whether it be a policy or monitoring tools or whatever it is. But we don't really dig much deeper than that. We don't say, like, okay, are you actually using these? We're not testing to say whether or not the organization is really compliant with it. A type 2 assessment assesses the operating effectiveness of your controls. And that's where it's actually looking over a period of time. And let's say they're saying, like, okay, we had an infrastructure monitoring tool in place that generates alerts based on predefined criteria of some sort of control language like that. That's when we as the auditors will come in and say, like, okay, basically prove that this was in place for this entire period. And that's where then sometimes we're like, oh yeah, well, we actually turned it on like a month ago, and like the alerting capabilities, we didn't really get fully honed in. And that's when you kind of get into that nuance of, like, okay, you can't really say that is really an operating control if you only turned it on 2 weeks ago and you're trying to say, like, oh yeah, for the last year we've been good. So that's where some of the difficulty comes in, because yeah, there's a lot of pre-work and there's a lot of ways that you kind of need to set yourself up for success, and really getting a good understanding of the framework beyond just a simple Google is obviously the best way. But then yeah, if you already are kind of compliant with some other assessment framework, that obviously makes it easier. But if you're really just kind of building a program from scratch, you kind of need to do a holistic internal review of like, what do we really have in place and what are people actually doing?
I know that brings up policies and procedures, which is one of Nick's main focuses. And Nick, how does a SOC assessment kind of tie into like what Adam was talking about with policies and procedures and communicating that within an organization?
That's probably one of the biggest portions for me, at least. It's one of the areas I think organizations are probably the most junior in that I've worked with, is they don't continue to either update or create new policies and procedures that, can guide, employees and their technical people. How do we keep them within the bumpers to either stay SOC compliant or become SOC compliant? So things that I've worked with organizations on is like outreach. You could gamify training, for example, right? Incentivize employees, right? On training, right? Teach them how to do things. Teaching them, you're creating these policies and procedures, and you're keeping the two in tow with each other. Newsletters is a big one that, we've worked with organizations on to train their staff, but we've spent a considerable amount of time, tailoring. And I think that's the conversation that we've been having today. You can tailor these SOC audits. And when we're doing these assessments with organizations, I think one of the big pieces that we're tailoring is those policies and procedures to kind of whip them into shape so they do follow the prescription that we're giving for SOC, right? How do we get them ready? And, going all the way back, talking about being SOC ready in X amount of days, I want to know two things: is what's their success rate, and what do you get if they don't get you ready in 2 weeks? Because anytime we've done SOC, right, it's much longer than that. Obviously, it would depend on the maturity of the organization. But yeah, policies and procedures, tech for me, as you said, Josh, we spend a lot of time there.
Yeah, I love this topic just about policies, procedures, organizational, just kind of culture, I think is kind of what we're speaking to, just kind of overarching. I think this probably goes back more to my internal auditing days, but it always shocks me how much time I spend. I will actually read all the different policies that an organization will give me. I actually do read them. I know that can seem shocking to them, but it kind of surprises me how frequently I will bring something up from somebody's policy, or I'll reference something, and sometimes, especially less mature organizations, but even very large, robust ones, because usually they have so many of them, they'll push back on me and say, like, what are you talking about? Where did you get this language? And I'll just be like, it's the third sentence in your information security policy. I didn't just fabricate this idea out of like, I don't know. Like, and so this is always kind of a topic that I like to spend, especially with my kind of less mature organizations. It's like, a policy truly it's a real thing. Like, you can't just say like, oh, we have a policy and then it gets filed on your intranet and then you never think about it. Like, if you just do that, then you don't actually have a policy. You have some random PDF that's saved on your intranet. But if you're not actually driving some sort of organizational culture with it, then it really doesn't matter. And yeah, of course, I've spent my entire professional career in audit. And especially when I was at my internal audit role, whenever I would show up at people's desks, there were, like, depending on who they were, some people were nicer than others, but usually they knew it's like, I was rarely there just for fun. I would try and make that part of my job. I actually would go around and just say hi to people, so they weren't always, like, what are you doing here?
Like the big bad wolf all the time.
Yeah, not all the time. Like, we would do all sorts of stuff. We would literally on Easter, we would walk around with a basket and hand out candy and all sorts of crazy stuff. But hey, it helped people like us a little bit better. And also I was like, but also I do need to talk to you about it's like, here's some chocolate and I have some bad news. But this is an area where, yeah, it really just kind of like, this goes back to even just our topic. Like, you can have a SOC audit, but we're only assessing what organizations put in there. And really at the end of the day, has to go down to organizational culture. And yeah, you're always going to get pushback from certain people that are like, well, I need this ability in order to do my job. Maybe that's true. Maybe it's not. But you need to be able to explain to them what the risk is by, if we give everybody local admin access on their laptop so that they can be installing whatever they want, that could be very bad. And here's why. And sometimes people still don't care. But then that's where you really need to rely on just kind of like, okay, well, it's still going to be the way that it is. At the end of the day, you need to remove that access from them. And so this kind of goes back to just all sorts of different concepts within information security, which is like, okay, if everybody just did what they were supposed to from the get-go, I wouldn't have a job. Probably none of us here would have a job. So I kind of always rely on like, okay, I don't want to say like, obviously I'm never happy about any of this stuff, but like, and by that I mean like data breaches and stuff, but there is a reason that people have to comply with certain things. But I think that's where it has to go back to, you have to explain the why. And if people lack context, if they lack that kind of insight as to why something's important, they're not going to take it seriously. And that's applicable to anything in life.
One of the most rewarding things I've found, and you've probably seen this too, when you go into an organization, usually the senior leadership on the security side loves it when an external auditor comes in. And I've had them just feeding me and like, this is, we don't do this good. We don't do this good. We don't do this good. And it's just like all of these things like, well, I haven't even looked at it yet. No, we don't do this good, because they want that third party attestation to be able to then come back, write it up, and then they'll be able to actually get money and maybe some clout to actually fix some of the problems.
Yep, drive organizational change through a different way. And I actually have that conversation with my clients not infrequently when they will bring things up like that themselves, because this also goes back to just kind of a point I wanted to make earlier. Compliance in any form, whether it be information security, whatever it might be, it can't just live in one particular subset of the organization. It can't just be the security team's issue. It really is everybody's issue. But I'll have people bring that up specifically, and I'll say, like, frankly, use us then. Great. Like, give me whatever detail and information you need to know so that I have the, evidence that I can kind of say, like, you're right. Even if they've brought up the same issue 50 times within their own organization, it is interesting when a third party is the one that's like, hey, you really do have an issue here, that all of a sudden it does get all of a sudden this, resources and scrutiny that it should internally. So I will often tell my clients that I'm like, I know I'm annoying. I'm constantly asking you to do a bunch of work and pull a bunch of stuff for me. My little joke that I like to say is that I'm a professional nuisance, because going through an audit, it's a lot of work. It is like people, and I try to like explain this sometimes to people. I'm like, I respect and understand that your job is well beyond pulling 400 different pieces of evidence for me. Like, you don't spend all year just sitting around twiddling your thumbs waiting for Adam to roll up. Like, if you are, like, I want that job.
So, Adam, one of the things that I found, I don't want to say enjoyable, but where I'm helping a company who's going through an audit, right? So we're essentially there to work on behalf of that company, and then the auditor comes in and they want to paper you, right? Like, oh, let me see this, let me see that, let me see this, and then it's like, okay, well, here it is. Understand that they need the information to do their job, and then there's usually around two where it's like, well, okay, you provided this, but we still need more. So provide more. And this is typically what I've seen with the big four firms, where they're coming in, and I think they get paid by the hour. I don't know. But then, it just seems to be this ongoing. And I'll go through 2 rounds, but on the 3rd round, I just say, not able to provide that. Just we'll take it as a finding. Go ahead and write it up. And that is, I've gotten the deer in the headlight look a couple of times, because I don't think they're used to that. But that is a way to just shut it down. Like, when you've had enough, when you're over audited, if you just say, write it up as a finding, then that's all they can do is write it up as a finding. And you're going to get the finding, but you're also not stuck 40 hours providing the same information 8 times.
Oh, yeah. Now, I mean, over auditing is absolutely a thing. That's why reasonable assurance. That's why it says that in the opinion letter, like, reasonable assurance. There definitely are auditors that get kind of like, they just really get on something and they want to keep digging and keep digging and keep digging, especially with some of my, just less experienced people I've worked with over my career. Sometimes I'd be like, okay, let's say this is wrong. What's the actual risk? Everything should always be tied back to risk. And sometimes people will get really wrapped around the axle on something in particular. And then it's like, okay, well, let's say all of this is wrong, or there is some sort of control bust here. So what? Kind of is like ultimately what the conversation should be around. And I actually had this exact same experience at my old organization. In internal audit, we actually managed a lot of our external assessments. And I had to have that exact conversation with an auditor. And it kind of helped that we were speaking the same language.
That makes a heck of a lot of sense. For less mature organizations, what would you guys recommend for them to do to get prepared for a SOC assessment specifically? If we're just getting started, maybe we have a few years under our belt, but we're kind of green to this whole scenario. What would you say would be kind of the quick checklist of let's have these things in place before heading down this path?
I mean, frankly, if you're an organization that has other SOC audits, you've probably gotten them from your vendors, start reading them and start seeing if you have controls in place that match up with what they already have and seeing where they fit within the report. That would be a great place to start, just to understand the language of how things are laid out. And it's there are certain things that just frankly, every organization, if you read every SOC report, 30% of the controls are going to be very, very similar. And it's just because at the end of the day, to meet certain criteria, they're not going to be word for word, but especially in certain kind of, I don't want to say generic criteria, but the first section of every SOC report, it's CC1 of the security criteria. It's really around HR, onboarding, governance of the organization as a whole. There's really only so many ways that you can really meet those criteria. So you can kind of say okay, yeah, of course we have a handbook in place. We require our employees to go through security training. We do background checks. It can be any number of things, and you can kind of do that. So I kind of start building out your actual control library and seeing how they fit within other SOC reports you have out there. I would then also encourage you, if you have the kind of bandwidth and the resources, you can go through a readiness assessment. As an auditor, we can't ever breach independence. We can't tell you exactly what to do, but that kind of gives you the opportunity to kind of have kind of some of these more, not informal conversations, but conversations with auditors where it's hey, here's the framework we have in place. Here's some of the stuff. Is this going to work? And we can kind of give you more of just a yes or no answer. It's yeah, that makes sense. I think that would work. Or it's yeah, that's a little shaky. Here's how maybe, other organizations do it. Maybe here's how you should consider thinking about expanding in this particular area just because you don't really have enough there to meet the criteria. And again, we can't tell you exactly what to do, but it gives us the opportunity to kind of just give you an overarching finger to the wind, how are we doing here? And then from there, you can then move into a type 1 and then into a type 2. Really kind of
I think I'm going back through on the side of the implementation of the controls. And one of the things that I'm currently wrestling with in an account is the implementation of those controls. These are regulated industries, and it's a fine line between communication and if there are nation state actors or threat actors in the environment. Do we want to give them a heads up that in 2 weeks from now, we are going to be making these changes and limiting this access? Or do we want to limit the access and then just say, oh, by the way, we've limited the access? It's kind of a fine line. I'm erring on the side of taking the action and then communicating afterwards, because it's a calculated risk of over communicating when there's a potential that you do have, especially in the political climate that we're in now, nation state actors that might be adversarial to us and taking advantage of us.
There's so much to grab onto. I think for us, when we're jumping into an organization, a lot of times we want to push for them to take these pre-assessments right away. Let's just see where we're at first off, right off the bat. And, something that we like to talk about too is delete. If we don't need to work on this right now, let's focus on something else. And on the other side, if we're helping an organization maybe go through an audit, I think there's a lot of times, and Adam talked about this, where they get hung up on maybe one control for far too long, where we can tie these back to something else. For example, I was recently having an issue with an organization going through a CJIS audit, or they're trying to become CJIS compliant with the BCA. The new regulations talk about commingling of data. And so you can't commingle CJIS data with not CJIS data. Well, the workaround a lot of times could be as simple as a retention policy. Do you have a retention policy that purges data, let's say from Teams, if you need to use Teams in that environment? So I think, what I would say to a lot of organizations is, maybe take a step back and look at controls you already have that probably could just be tied to a problem that you're having in an audit.
You've been listening to The Audit presented by IT Audit Labs. My name is Joshua Schmidt, your co-host and producer. You've been joined by Eric Brown and Nick Mellum of IT Audit Labs. And we've been talking today with Adam Russell Schellman. Thanks so much, Adam, for your time. It's been a great conversation, and we hope to stay in touch.
Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. Please like, share, and subscribe, and stream us wherever you source your podcast content. We're on Spotify now with video, and we have episodes every other week. So hope to see you soon.
You have been listening to The Audit, presented by IT Audit Labs. We are experts at assessing risk and compliance while providing administrative and technical controls to improve our clients' data security. Our threat assessments find the soft spots before the bad guys do, identifying likelihood and impact, while all our security control assessments rank the level of maturity relative to the size of your organization. Thanks to our devoted listeners and followers, as well as our producer, Joshua J. Schmidt, and our audio-video editor, Cameron Hill. You can stay up to date on the latest cybersecurity topics by giving us a like and a follow on our socials and subscribing to this podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you source your security content.